Welcome to the Sober Living Stories podcast. This podcast is dedicated to sharing stories of sobriety. We shine a spotlight on individuals who have faced the challenges of alcoholism and addiction and are today living out their best lives sober. Each guest has experienced incredible transformation and are here to share their story with you. I'm Jessica Stepanovic, your host. Join me each week as guests from all walks of life share their stories to inspire and provide hope to those who need it most. Welcome to another episode of the Sober Living Stories podcast. Today, my guest is Elizabeth, a divorced mom to a 4.5-year-old. She's currently editing her memoir, Lonely Girl, detailing her journey to self-love and acceptance, including her recovery from problem drinking. She's also the co-founder of the Inspired Writer Collective, an online community for writers. Get ready to be inspired as Elizabeth shares her story with you. Welcome, Elizabeth. So good to have you here.
I'm so happy to be here, Jessica. Thank you.
Can you just start at the beginning and bring listeners to the point in your life where you made a choice to be alcohol-free and how that has positively influenced you, and any other parts of your story that you feel would inspire change for someone else?
I really wasn't exposed to alcohol in any great way until I went off to college. In my household growing up, nobody drank. My grandparents didn't drink. It wasn't a part of any of the dynamic that I grew up around. Some of that is because there is some family history, a couple of generations back, of alcoholism. But I kind of went into college with very little knowledge of drinking habits, anything like that. I would say I had a typical college experience as far as the just binge drinking, heavier drinking on the weekends at parties and social gatherings, and not really consuming anything during the week. I've definitely had some nights where I've blacked out or have a fuzzy memory. But for the most part, my drinking, especially anything in excess, was of a social nature.
Okay.
As I entered into the career field, I worked in a very stressful career of forensic science. And there's definitely an embedded culture of drinking to help deal with the stress of the work, the sort of things you're exposed to as you report to crime scenes, and the decompression afterwards is usually heavily alcohol laced. So I continue to notice that trend in my life, usually again in a social way. And it's interesting for me because at no point during any of that did I question my drinking. I felt like it was still very accepted by society. There were plenty of people who I socialized with who drank a lot more than I did. And because I never had to face any major consequences, such as injuries or DUIs or anything that would be a super big red flag that I needed to stop, I didn't pay much attention to it. What actually happened as far as a turning point for me was after I left my job, left my career, and my family moved from Minnesota to Colorado, and we were living in an RV. At that point, I had transitioned from a working mom to a full-time stay-at-home mom to a 2-year-old. What I noticed at that time was a craving for my nightly habitual drink. And it would be a singular drink. It would be a glass of wine or a beer or a mixed drink. But what was troublesome to me was that I would have that mental interruption starting at noon of looking at my watch and wondering, oh, how much longer till I can have that drink? How much longer, would it be reasonable to maybe start the drink before my then wife gets home? Or should I
Mhm.
wait until she gets back and have it with dinner? And depending on the stresses of the day, the feelings of stuckness by being confined in an RV with a toddler all day, I was using that nightly drink as a coping mechanism for my anxiety, for my lack of a social life all of a sudden, and my general just feeling of being lost and uncertain of what I was going to do next.
Mm. That's really interesting because they talk a lot about with the disease of alcoholism, whether you have that or not, but um, they talk about that phenomenon of craving. And you defined it so well with like a mental interruption because it becomes something that we can't get out of our mind. And then we start to move things around or say, would it be okay if I move that up to 2 p.m.? And, until eventually, with a lot of people, it takes over their entire life. So you said that really well. And also, I think not knowing or thinking when you look around, well, that person's drinking more than me. So clearly I can't have a problem.
Yeah, and that craving piece is interesting when I tried to explain to someone recently because they looked at, at least at the point that I quit drinking,
Mm.
oh, that's not that bad. You could drink again probably. And then I explained that mental piece and those cravings and they were like, "Oh, I can relate to that from my own addiction. I recognize that as an addictive quality." I didn't join any sort of sober community, at that point. I went about a year before I reached out for, a sober community. I was not super open to AA for religious reasons, and I also was really concerned about going into one of those recovery meetings of any form, affiliated or not, and feeling like I wouldn't be accepted because I wasn't quote unquote bad enough, right? Would these communities welcome me in if I was saying, I think I have a problem, I don't want to do this anymore? Would I be kind of looked on negatively? Now I know after having been in these communities that I was very accepted, but that was my perception from
Sure.
the outside. And that's one of
Mm-hmm.
the messages that I hope that, someone listening today who may question their own drinking and wants that support system of a community, please don't have that same fear that I had. I mean, it was unfounded. I
Sure,
ultimately
sure.
found a group and they were very supportive of where I was and the healthy changes I wanted to make to my life.
Yes, yeah. And that's great. And thanks for clarifying that because it is really important. And I haven't found a larger community of such acceptance on all levels as, say, like a 12 step or a sober community. They just so are. Like, if you're wanting to be there, you're allowed to be there. And that's a good for people to know and to understand that.
I ended up seeking it out because I wanted the social engagement again in my
Mhm.
life. Um, Again, this was about a year into sobriety and a year into living in Colorado, and I was trying to expand my social world, but do so in a way that would give me still some buffer from socializing around alcohol-centric environments.
Sure.
And I had also, at that point, around the 1 year mark, started to entertain ideas that I could moderate my
Mhm.
drinking, that, I had broken the habit because I did recognize that based on the quantities I was drinking, it really was more of a habit of drinking than maybe necessarily an addiction to the substance, but the habit was still toxic. And
Sure.
so
Sure.
I found myself wondering, well, could I moderate? Could I maybe only drink at like big social events? Am I really never going to drink again at
Mm.
my, siblings' future weddings? At, you think through the whole
Sure.
gamut of, major social events where alcohol is prominent. And that questioning is what ultimately took me to go down the stairs of the basement of the local church to a recovery group.
Mhm. Yeah. And did you find answers when you were there?
For sure. And even just that support system of other people in it for the long term helped quiet my questions about moderating. And it helped me see that I could socialize without
Mhm.
alcohol, because in that year gap, I still didn't have much of a social life because we had, been living in a new place. And most of my socializing revolved around my kids since I was a stay-at-home parent. So it was all play dates and hikes and other things that are generally, alcohol removed. So it was very helpful to have that community. Not only did I attend the meetings, but there was a group of us kind of at similar places in our lives. And we ended up
Mhm.
having some sober game nights, some sober pizza parties,
Mhm.
and went to like a show together, and just expanded our social realm within that group or from that group. And that was very helpful for me to have that support and to have activities that were adult centric, but not
Sure.
alcohol involved.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that's one of the biggest fears is like, well, one, can I do this without the alcohol? Will it be the same? Is it going to be boring? Is it going to be, and then when you go ahead and ask those questions and people say, yeah, here, go here. Or if you do go somewhere where there's alcohol involved, like we talk about all those firsts, like the first wedding, the fear of being there and the toast and what am I going to do? And the first time it seems so huge and you just like, how am I going to get around it? And once you walk through that, the first Christmas, the first Thanksgiving, where there's just more of everything, you walk through it, and at times you can step outside or you can take a breath or you can make that phone call. You get to the other side of it, and then you know that it's possible and you get to do it again, and then you start having a really good time without it. Did you find that as
Absolutely.
well? Mm-hmm.
Yes, I did. And some of the impetus for giving up the alcohol was I had drastically changed so much of my life in
Mm-hmm.
association with that move. I had left my career. I was letting go of all kinds of, unhealthy habits. And so I felt like to hold on to this last one, this other one that I knew was unhealthy, when I was trying to be more physically active and get outdoors more and read more and all sorts of things like that, it just seemed really out of place in my life when I knew that my larger objective was to be healthier. And I had made such drastic changes in so many other areas of my life. I really
Mm-hmm.
questioned why I was holding on to that last piece. At the time, I would treat it as a reward for getting through my day or whatnot. And I had picked up a book, Sober Curious, and
Mm-hmm.
as I was reading that book, I didn't get too far into it before I felt like, well, if I can't quit, then that means I really do have a problem. So then I felt like I had to prove that I could stop drinking, or else I had to accept that it was really an issue and an
Right.
addiction. And it
Yeah.
was, I didn't plan my, sober date. It was literally just the day I read that particular part in the book and had that conviction in that sense. And from that day forward, October over 2 years ago, I just didn't drink again.
Wow.
I had,
And
because it was a habit, I ended up, replacing that nightly fun drink with
Mhm.
LaCroix or a hot chocolate
Right.
with marshmallows and other, decadent fun drinks in the first couple of months. But I would say by about the fifth month, I really didn't have much interest in
Mhm.
alcohol or even needing some kind of special nightly beverage. At that point, the habit of having a reward at the end of the day had
Mhm.
subsided, and I just had just more general satisfaction with my day. I had less anxiety, I had better sleep, and those things I saw instant, like pretty early on with cutting out the alcohol. But as my anxiety decreased, that need for a reward, that
Mm.
anticipation of the relief at the end of the day wasn't as necessary.
Yeah. And that's a great point because I know for myself early on, before I even knew I had a problem with alcohol, as I did, I thought it was helping my depression. I thought it was helping my anxiety. Why would I give this up? This is the one thing that alleviates all that, when in fact it really doesn't. And it just adds to it. And so for you to say, hey, I saw positive change immediately is really great and I love that you're sharing your story because it just speaks so well to the fact that this is our decision. That's your decision. You can get off whenever you want to. We don't have to wait until we're full blown alcoholics. Like you can live an alcohol free lifestyle immediately if you say so, and if it's interrupting your normal functioning of your day, even slightly, and like you did, you replaced it with things that were positive, with health, with different drinks that didn't have anything to do with it, and you saw immediate results. It was so good.
Yeah, and ultimately my bigger motivation was because I really didn't like the messaging that I felt like was being put out to my daughter, that I needed this drink at the
Yeah.
end of the day to deal with her. I knew that that was toxic messaging, even if that's not what I intended by having my nightly beverage. But all of that ruminating and craving that would
Mm-hmm.
happen for the, several hours leading up to, the end of the day, to dinner time, when I would crack a beer open, I I didn't want that for her. I didn't want her to ever think that I needed that in order to deal with her. That was not my experience as a child. Like I said, alcohol was not present in my home growing up, and I didn't want that for her. So it did give
Yeah.
me a lot of
Excellent.
peace knowing that at 2 years
Mhm.
old, she will never remember a time in her life where I felt like I needed a drink in order to deal with my role as a mom, or to deal with my frustrations at my lack of satisfaction in my life, with my career trajectory or my social life or anything
Mhm.
like that.
Wow, that's really powerful and good. Yeah, it's excellent. She won't have that memory. Yeah,
No.
and that's a good, thinking ahead and wanting to give her that example. Maybe at 2 she wouldn't have known, but maybe at 4 she would have. So to just lay that down and say, no, this is not going to be a part of my life, in my family, in my house. That's really powerful.
I mean, even at 2, she would ask for a sip of whatever I had. She would eat off my plate. She would want, a sip of my drink. And to have to tell her no, that's, whatever code word you use. I've said mommy juice. I've said, whatever else.
Right. And that's
Like, no, that's
right.
an adult drink. You can't have any of that.
Right.
It
And
just,
that's just gone now. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
She doesn't even
It
have
felt
that as a
wrong.
reference. That's
Yeah.
great. That's great because, parenting, it's such a big joy, and it's also so difficult sometimes because, like within the course of a day, you're going from 0 to 100 and different emotions. It's an emotional job. You're dealing with their emotions and yours and how you deal with it, and high roading and not reacting so they don't model that, and it's a lot. And so to be able to say, hey, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to cope with parenting by with this. That was an incredible choice to make for you, and a really good one.
Yeah, there was a void left with the move. I didn't have a local support system, and I was using alcohol as a filler for that.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I had to get rid of that and then replace it with actual support,
Yeah.
with the sober
So
community.
can you speak a little bit about the community of support you found for sobriety, but and then also some other forms of support that you now have around you and career wise and stuff that's just helped your life kind of fulfill itself without it?
So I joined a local all recovery meeting. So it was not affiliated with a 12-step program of any sort. Everyone was able and free to define themselves with whatever words, titles, labels that they felt pertain to them at any moment of time.
Mhm.
And it included people who were dealing with alcohol as well as various drugs. And I really resonated with just with the broader level of acceptance I felt within the group.
Mhm.
And they just created an environment where I knew that whatever I brought to the table, whether it was frustrations with motherhood or uncertainty about some of these other local groups I was joining and not them not understanding that I didn't want to be around alcohol and things like that. I had joined a roller derby league in an effort
Mhm.
to
No
step
way.
out of my role as mom for a couple of hours a week. And while the group of women was phenomenal, there was definitely a lot of integrated drinking, post practice, post games.
Is that
And
something you always wanted to do? How did you choose that?
yeah, I loved
It's
watching roller
like,
derby. So I've
really? That
been
is so neat.
a viewer, a person in the stands for roller derby. I thought the exercise would be helpful, but also that like camaraderie piece. And so that's why I pursued that. But ultimately, it was difficult, at least at that point in my sobriety, to navigate
Mhm.
the alcohol dynamic and still feel like I was making any sort of meaningful connection. I could
Sure.
observe
Okay.
from an outside perspective that this group was tight knit and they, would hang out and socialize with each other outside of practice. But I found once I joined that all of that socializing was around like the bars or, going skiing and having drinks in the lodge and that sort of
Mhm.
thing. And that just wasn't going to be a scene I could operate effectively in at that point.
Yeah. Okay. So you made different choices. Yeah.
Right. I also found a lot of support within the, my fellow mom, stay-at-home mom community.
Hmm.
Ultimately, I've taken a couple of those friendships and they've developed further, but I did reach a point in my social life where I just needed some socializing that was outside of my identity as a mom. And that's
Yeah.
where the game nights with the sober group are really helpful as well.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a good point to kind of do things that aren't affiliated with being a mom and what you love and you do apart from that. So also you're a writer and you're editing a memoir called Lonely Girl, which when I heard your title, I thought how incredibly impactful is that for me to hear? Like it just grabbed me. And I think it's going to grab a lot of people. Can you speak a little bit about your writing and how maybe it was positively influenced by this decision as well? Because I know in my own life, when I was drinking, I was writing, but when I stopped drinking, I really wrote. And that's when things started to get published or paid for or just advancement, like it just kind of came to. So, how about your experience with that? Could you share a little bit on that?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. So the Lonely Girl title comes from this hike I was on around the same time that I sought out that sober community. So this was 1 year into living in Colorado, 1 year into sobriety. I was doing a circular loop that I would tend to do while my daughter was at half day preschool. And I just was struck with this feeling that I felt so alone. And a lot of that had to do with what I just spoke about how my identity seemed to have condensed to that as just mom. And I, was no longer this career woman and I didn't really have a community to express my, sober side in or my creative side or my writer part. And so
Mm-hmm.
I really was struggling with my identity, with where my life was going, with who I even was. So I started writing the book, I guess we're right at a year now.
Mhm.
Um, and the story does go back even further into my childhood about community, about identity. I've got my coming out story and things like
Mhm.
that, my experience with alcohol, and then later sobriety, and then some of my struggles in motherhood. And initially, the focus of the book was about finding that community, especially after a move and these shifts in identity. And then life continued to happen as it does. And over the course of the last 6 months, I've got divorced. I became a business owner by starting the Inspired Writer Collective, and I got more serious about my writing. I found a writing community. I had my sober community. I had much more diversity in my social outlets and
Mhm.
expressions of various aspects of my identity. So I went through a lot of personal development and self growth, and
Mhm.
that meant that my memoir has also done that. So while I initially set out
Sure.
to write a memoir about finding community and those external supports, the ultimate message is about self love and value and self worth and my own
Mhm.
journey to finding that, my struggles with that, and ultimately the result and how it shows up in my life now, and how I show up for myself, how I show up for my daughter, and also the immense amount of support that I've garnered within my community because of those connections that I've built and because of the way that I can show up more authentically as myself
Mhm.
when I'm not hiding behind labels or alcohol or expectations and those sort of
Yeah.
struggles.
Yeah, well let's talk about that a little bit because to actually head out and enter a community takes a certain amount of courage because especially in a sober community because you're having to be vulnerable, honest and show your real self so that you can get to a real solution.
So my first effort was to figure out like what pieces of myself I didn't feel had an avenue for expression. That's what took me to the sober group because I didn't have any way socially to express that sober side of myself. That's also what led me to things like the writers group because as I got started writing the memoir, I needed some support as a writer.
Mhm.
I am more introverted, so I tend to, while I will force myself to show up in some groups of a like medium-ish size,
Mhm.
I ultimately end up picking out like a handful of individuals that I feel like I really resonate with, and then I try to foster those relationships one on one. That's just
Okay.
what I found works for me.
Mhm.
So, my friend Stephanie, who you know, and who I met
Yes.
through my writers group, she was one of the first people that I really felt like I resonated with within
Mhm.
the writers group. And so we went out for coffee and now we own a business together. She's the
That's
co-founder of the
incredible.
Inspired Writer Collective.
Wow.
So in taking the time to understand how you as an individual can show up as yourself and form those authentic connections, that's
Mhm.
what's really important. Like right, and with each of the strong relationships that I have now, that started back around that same time frame,
Mhm.
it required a step of vulnerability. Now, most of the time I did that once I was one-on-one with someone because that was the only way that I really felt comfortable in doing that. But it required me to be vulnerable and for
Yeah.
me to be open to the other person's vulnerability. And for an example, one way that that looked was the RV we were living in flooded in the middle of winter. The pressure regulator got frozen
Ugh.
open, and all of a
Mhm.
sudden, water was gushing into the RV in the middle of
Mhm.
January. It was a nightmare. It totaled it. It was a lost
Uh-huh.
cause, and that was our home. And all of a sudden, I was moving myself, my wife, my kid, and two cats into a hotel room while we
Oh.
looked for a rental that we could move into. And, I was really scared, but I reached out for some support within a mom's group, a hiking group that I had joined. And the facilitator of that group offered her guest room and guest bathroom to us for 2.5 weeks. And
Wow.
I moved my family into her house, and
Oh
we
my
sort of
goodness.
had this amazing co-parenting dynamic between her two kids and my kid. And her
Mhm.
husband was out of town for this time period, so she was solo parenting. So it was a benefit to everyone to have extra adults on hand, but it
Sure.
required being really, really vulnerable. And ultimately, you just have to make those choices carefully about who deserves your vulnerability.
Hmm.
But it did require me to be vulnerable in order to form those really close connections.
Sure.
Right. And you
And
do, you have
going
to
in
foster
real.
them.
Yeah. Going in your real self too. That's really gets you to the people you need to be next to quickest, not putting
And
on
for
that
me,
false front.
personally, receiving help is very hard. And not only is receiving help hard, but asking for help is a whole different level of
Mm.
vulnerability for me. So even being willing to accept this generous offer was hard. And in all honesty, it's probably because my back was against the wall at the moment as
Sure.
far as options that I was willing to take it. But ultimately, those connections have served me well.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the Inspired Writer Collective?
Sure. So Stephanie and I have really benefited from having an in-person writers group. So there's one that's hosted through our local library here in Colorado. And then there's also a broader group that they're called the Central Colorado Writers Exchange. And they offer some intermittent like trainings, a monthly collective writing session with
Hmm.
prompts, or sometimes it's focused on a particular lesson. And then they have a critique group where you can submit, say, a chapter. I think the cap is like 3,000 words, for feedback and critique from other writers. And so we've really benefited in our own writing from having access to these groups. As I was working on the actual writing portion of my memoir, my sister was also working on hers. She was actually the one who encouraged me to start writing because she was doing like this 30-day write a book challenge and asked if I wanted to join. And I said, sure, send me the link.
Uh-huh.
And she looked at her local community at the time, which was Modesto, California, a much
Mhm.
larger area than my tiny little town in Colorado. And they kind of laughed at her at the library when she asked if there was a local writers group, because there wasn't one. And that's the thing, is Stephanie and I realized just how blessed we are to have those in-person resources and how beneficial that's been to our each of our writing. But so many communities don't have those resources, or there are times, such as summertime, when I'm home doing childcare, where even I can't attend the in-person
Sure.
opportunities. Or Stephanie is going back and forth between Colorado and elsewhere, and she's not here to attend those in-person benefits. And so we were both really inspired to create some sort of online community, and we had kind of different focuses. And one day we were catching up on a Zoom call, and I said, "Why don't we just do this together?" And she was like,
Uh-huh.
let's just do this together. She was like, why don't we, like, I don't know, launch it in December? And this was like October. And I
Hmm.
was like, okay, why
Yeah.
not? Um, so we're working to curate a space that has accountability for writing. We have right now 5 hours a week that are Zoom calls where people can join us for a writing session that is, whatever your current writing project is, wherever you are in the process, outlining, writing, editing. We do a quick introduction of what we're working on, what our goal is for that time. We set a timer, everyone blacks out their screens, mutes, writes independently, and then we come back at the end for celebrating our wins, our successes, and any feedback that we might want to ask the group for. We've got a book club that we've just launched, reading like a writer, looking at books and
Excellent.
analyzing character development and plotting and dialogue and tension management, pacing of the story that we're really excited about. But it just comes from a larger understanding that we have personally benefited, our writing has benefited from
Sure.
having community and that accountability of the community. And we recognize that not everyone has access to it. And we even don't always have access to it because of the nature of our schedules and our lives.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. If anyone's listening that is a writer or working on a book, and I can attest to the fact that writing sessions are the number one way to get words on a page. It's like that accountability, and the scheduled meeting times for me were that's how it got written, on my own, left to my own devices and my own schedule that gets interrupted all the time. I mean, when I had those sessions in place and showed up, uh, they were like any other appointment that happened during the week. And so it allowed me to take my writing really seriously. And so I think it's incredible that you've created that space. It's called the Inspired Writer Collective. And I think it's incredible that you created that space for people, and I hope it goes really well. And for you as well, in doing your editing and stuff, it's that, how long are the sessions that you offer?
They're essentially an hour total, but the actual writing time of each one is typically about 40 minutes because we have a brief discussion at the beginning and then we come back together at the end. But it's usually 40
Great.
minutes of devoted writing time over the course of an hour.
Well, that's great. Really great. And we'll, of course, put your information in the show notes so that people can go there to look. It's called the Inspired Writer Collective. You're also on Instagram, correct?
Yeah, so the
And
Instagram will
you have
get
a
you to all of our other links. Our community is hosted on the Mighty Networks platform. We have a TikTok and a bunch of free downloads and guides and quick tips and things as well.
great. Did you want to talk a little bit about your podcast? Did you have a
Oh, sure.
podcast? Do you want to? I know I'd seen you on YouTube a number of times. Do you have a podcast that you do on a weekly basis? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I actually have two podcasts because I
Oh,
don't do
okay, good.
anything, moderately, it seems. Um, Stephanie and I have a podcast associated with our writing group, and it's under the same name, Inspired Writer Collective. And we are now on Apple Podcasts as well as Spotify, and we release new episodes every Monday. If you prefer a video format, you'll see those video episodes on YouTube on our YouTube channel. I
Great.
also have a separate podcast that I record with my sister, and that is exclusively on our YouTube channel because it's not associated with any sort of business endeavors or anything like that. But it's called We Should Have Recorded That. And it is our own early entrepreneurial journeys because she has started a community herself in the health and wellness field. And then I've got my writers community. So we talk often about the personal development involved, like the struggles with doubt that we have in putting ourselves out there, how we've chosen to value our communities and our products and what we put out. We just released a episode on the art of the pivot, meaning those times when you suddenly have to make quick adjustments and what that looks like and how to handle that. And we've been releasing episodes every week, and those have typically come out on Thursday or Friday of the week.
I will definitely check that out.
Lots of sister antics. We were having all of these amazing conversations on the phone because I talked to her for a couple of hours each day as we are both stay-at-home moms, full-time moms trying to run businesses. And we just kept thinking, oh, this was great insight. We should have recorded that. People need to hear this.
Mhm.
And the own reflection we have that a lot of the resources you find online are people who make $10,000 a month and here, do this quick thing, use your email list to, market XYZ. And here we were both averse to social media, no email
Mm-hmm.
list to be heard of, starting these communities and trying to find a way as the primary caregivers in our families in order to provide some additional income and support for our families.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was our motivation for taking our conversations that we were going to have anyways and recording them and posting them.
I love that. I think it's another great title. And is there anything else you'd like to add? We've talked about being alcohol free, self acceptance, writing along with the narrative of your actual life. So, is there anything else you would like to put out there to anyone who's choosing to make positive change in their life, whether it be putting alcohol down or anything else down that's just not working for them, and how they can do that?
Well, I'll leave them with this insight. I was just listening to Atomic Habits by James Clear. And in the chapter I listened to yesterday, he said, and I'll paraphrase, but I have some scribbled notes here, that in order to build a better habit, you need to find a culture that, one, is exhibiting the desired behavior, and that is a normal behavior for that community. And two, you already have something in common with the group. This
Mm-hmm.
is what I found to be so helpful in finding sober community. This is what I found to be helpful in finding the community of fellow moms, what I'm seeking and connecting with fellow entrepreneurs and podcasters, and truly the essence of what Stephanie and I have attempted to create with our Inspired Writer Collective.
So good. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your story, sharing your insights, and sharing your whole writing journey and what you have out there for others to also join in on. Be sure to keep an eye out for Elizabeth's upcoming book, The Lonely Girl. Connect with Elizabeth on Instagram at @ewilsonwrites or her writing community at Inspired Writer Collective. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. And thank you for this amazing space that you've created to allow for that sense of community, connection, and for people to show up with vulnerability and authenticity.
Thank you for tuning into the Sober Living Stories podcast. If you have been inspired, consider subscribing and sharing with anyone who could use hope in their lives. Remember to stay tuned for more inspiring stories in the episodes to come. To view our featured author of the month or to become a guest yourself, visit www.jessicastepanovic.com.